Dr. Walter Trankler lived in an ordinary, respected life as a physician in 1970s Spain, until a knock on his door one day made him question everything around him. When he answered the knock, two shabby-looking men with the most peculiar look in their eyes introduced themselves as his newest housekeeper's father and brother, Harald and Frank Alexander. Their sister Sabine worked as a maid on Dr. Trankler's estate, but he'd never met her family until now. He called the 15-year-old Sabine from the kitchen and left the family at the door to chat, but just before stepping away to give them some privacy, the doctor couldn't help but overhear something during their conversation that stopped him dead in his tracks. When he told this story later, he only remembered looking over at Sabine to see how she would react to what her father said. The young housekeeper took her father's hands in hers. It was covered with what looked like dirt from the fields, and she held it to her cheek, telling him, "I'm sure you have done what you think is necessary." He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed, but he immediately knew his life was in danger. And what he thought was dirt caked all over their hands and clothes? Yeah, that was blood. Dr. Trankler ran to his bedroom without another word and barricaded himself inside to call the police so he could tell them what he'd just seen and he heard. When they arrived, the doctor reiterated how he had overheard Mr. Alexander tell his daughter that he and her older brother had just spent the afternoon murdering the rest of their family. Her 42-year-old mother, Dagmar, and her two older sisters, 15-year-old Petra and 17-year-old Marina. If you're shocked already, you've heard nothing about this crazy case yet. When police asked Harald Alexander and his son about the doctor's story, Harald confirmed that it was all true. They'd sent the woman to heaven. The cops even asked him a second time because they couldn't believe what they were hearing either. He told them every detail of the murders he and his son had just committed with such candidness, and he even told them that the address where it took place. Once investigators were dispatched to the Alexander home, they discovered 3 bodies, mutilated beyond recognition, lying in the apartment. It was a horror show, spread from one end of the apartment to the other. 1 body discovered in the bedroom and 2 in the Alexander's living room. They arrested Harald and Frank Alexander on the spot and took Sabine in for further questioning. The story she told and the scene they discovered at the Alexander home went further beyond anything any of them could have even imagined. Harald Alexander was a stonemason in the early 1950s Hamburg. In Germany, he befriended an older man named George Riehl, who happened to be the leader of the Protestant splinter sect called the Lorber Society. This cult society was founded in the 1800s and is based upon the teachings of Jacob Lorber, an Austrian mystic who heard the voice of Jesus Christ in his chest. It commanded him to write what it dictated to him, and he obeyed, turning down an assistant musical director's position at the Trieste Theater to scribe over 10,000 pages of print from the voice. Jesus dictated a total of 25 lengthy books and a variety of pamphlets to Lorber, and these are the texts that he wrote and founded his new sect upon. He called it the New Salem Society, and after his death, the voice continued to speak through a succession of the Lorber Society leaders, and the canonized revelations numbered above 40 volumes. The sect conformed to broader Christian revivals around the globe that were also based on the idea of dispensationalism, in which prophets are given periodical dispensations of divine knowledge throughout human history, like Moses, John the Baptist, Jesus Christ, Joseph Smith, and in this case, Jacob Lorber. Lorber's sect practiced Christian renunciation, meaning they swore off earthly temptations and luxuries in the pursuit of God's favor. It was only temporarily sent underground after the German annexation of Austria, but later resurfaced and became the cult that Harald Alexander would join with his wife by the middle of the 20th century. The Lorber Society was extreme, and the headmaster of this cult likewise had a lot of control over its members, who were always desperate to please God by sticking to their beliefs, strict guidelines, and renunciations. Lorber's revelations were inspired by an ancient interpretation of Christianity, in which God's universe was the backdrop for a utopian society of living love, and this society would be peppered with divine sparks, people who manifested God's essence on earth like the prophets. They also believed that the world at large outside of the cult was sinful and always being leveraged against its will by Satan, so he can stop Jesus' utopian plan and snuff out the divine sparks his new society depended upon. So the Alexander family and most other Lorber Society members kept to themselves, but there was still hope for them. Lorber prophesied that Jesus would be reborn to begin the end times and bring the reign of God's new millennium on earth, maybe around the year 2000. I don't know about you, but George's preaching was music to Harald Alexander's ears. The couple committed to the Lorber Society's lifestyle and all Riehl's teachings for years to come until George Riehl reached his deathbed in the 1960s. With their leader's life on the line, fate of the Lorber Society hung in the balance. George spent his final moments alone with Harald, and when Harald returns his wife and the society, he proclaims that George made him the new leader of the cult. There were no other witnesses to this change of reigns, but everyone in the cult took Harald at his word, and he and Dagmar were exalted to the highest status in the cult. Harald's next few years at the cult's helm saw him preparing the congregation for the coming prophecies that would define God's will and their role to play in it. Harald used Lorber's teaching to manipulate the cult's expectations for years. With the dawn of the new millennium coming, the prophecy would be starting at any time, and he alone would make sure the flock knew when Lorber's prophecy and the ones he'd begun on his own would come to pass. The material manifestation of Harald's divine prophecy finally came with the birth of Harald and Dagmar's first son, Frank. Frank was the new prophet sent by God to redeem the Christian world, specifically that of the Lorber society that they've been waiting for. Harald told the society that Frank would usher in the new age, and never before had the fate of humanity been at Satan's peril as such before, as Frank had become key to the universe's eternal salvation. As the leader of the cult, every member of the society, as well as the Alexander family, had complete faith in Harald's prophecies. In the Lorber society, Frank was the most cherished prophet since Jesus Christ himself, and the impact of his prophetic status escalated him to an unrivaled social status within the only society that anyone in the family knew. He was dotted on night and day by his family and the rest of the cult. His older sister had even started complaining to friends at school about how envious she was of the prophet she shared her household with. But Harald did nothing to stop the delusions of grandeur that his son was being encouraged into by their entire community, and depended on the power of the prophecy to sustain his status as leader of the cult. So Frank's personality maladapted into his adolescence, and as a human being, he had to deal with the same sexual developments everyone goes through as teenagers. But with that Christ-like status within his family cult, Frank couldn't reconcile his sexual urges with the restrictions of their faith renunciations. If everyone outside the Lorber society was a part of the forces of darkness, people of the wider public belonged to a doomed caste of Satan-loving heretics with whom the prophet could never be allowed any interaction. Harald preached it would be blasphemy. So how was Frank supposed to satisfy his sexual and reproductive needs? Frank's proposition to his father was that he'd be allowed to have his way with his own sisters and mother to keep their prophetic bloodline pure. Harald agrees, and even goes as far to take part in the inappropriate activity between Frank and his other family members. Having been so deeply brainwashed into the ideas Harald peddled within the cult and its implications, it's believed that his daughters and wife had been completely convinced of their brother's divinity. They weren't in a psychological position to advocate for themselves in any aspect of their lives, let alone what went on at the hands of their brother Frank at home behind closed doors. But with all the darkness pervasive in this case, blame falls most easily to those who ended the entire story with murder. As the Alexander children grew older and the family situation at home continued to devolve, rumors spread through the kids' school. And it wasn't long before Harald had heard himself that the Hamburg police were actively investigating all of their activities. When the other members of the Lorber Society found out about Frank and Harald's perverse transgressions, Harald's prophecies no longer held sway with the wider community. They were excommunicated from the cult. Harald took it upon himself to resign, and the family fled to southern Spain to escape the heat of the investigation. But within the family, his cult's indoctrinations still tragically prevailed. The Alexander family resumed their previous behavior, and Frank Alexander himself recounted how half of the family finally ended up brutalized in a lethal spree of spiritual psychosis. Harald and Frank preached a prophecy called the killing hour. At one point during the theological deliberations, Frank had concluded that women were an impure sex and required ritualistic purification, and he and his father would have to be the ones to redeem women's souls through sacrificial murder. Since their agreement, the rest of the family awaited the fulfillment of the prophecy. On the day of their arrest, Frank told investigators that he was sitting on the edge of the bed over his mother, and she gave him a look that deeply, deeply disturbed him. He described it as a suggestive look, that it was an impure look that she wasn't permitted to have given him, and that's when he knew that the killing hour had dawned upon them. To send his family members to heaven, Frank takes a nearby clothes hanger and strikes his mother across the face with it. To comply with the prophecy, his mother actually collects herself to lay face down in bed and allow Frank to continuously beat her over the back of the head with the hanger. That's right, the women of the Alexander household and maybe even the entire Lorber society had come to believe that they would need to be purified by a man through sacrifice to the holy prophet, Frank. At some point, when the boy thought it was the right time. If this wasn't the most horrific thing you've ever heard already, Harald gets so excited that the prophecy has begun that he springs over to the family's harmonium, this kind of organ-like instrument, and starts playing the most sinister tune you could possibly imagine. Like literally a creepy horror movie organ is being played while Frank murders his mother and sister in the other room of the house. I can't imagine how twisted the scene must have been. These murders took so long that Frank and Harald started switching off between beating the rest of their family and playing the organ, taking turns at each when the other got tired of killing. When the killing hour had come to pass, Frank and Harald sang and danced around the home and celebrated at length before ending up at Dr. Trankler's estate in handcuffs. The pair of them would be deemed unfit for trial after a psychiatric evaluation, and really all you need is to see the photos of them after their arrest to know that they were committed to an asylum for criminally insane by the state. Frank and Harald has still never shown any remorse for their crimes, believing that this was the woman's only way to enter the kingdom of heaven. As for Sabine, she repeatedly beseeched the authorities to let her stay in the same psychiatric institution as her father and brother, but she was sent to a convent with nuns and appeared to get the opportunity to live with them again. This story reads like a Greek tragedy from thousands of years ago. Almost 20 years later, in 1990, Harald and Frank Alexander escaped. They fled from the asylum that they were confined to and have not been seen since then. They're still at large to this day. Like leaving my house had to get any scarier. The confessions are explicit in this case, but it makes me wonder how often this sort of story can go on, long enough for the rest of us not to realize it until it's too late. Believe it or not, cases like this can go on right under our noses, no matter who you are or where you're from. Guys, thank you so much for watching another episode. My name is Mac, and we'll catch you guys on the next episode of Killer Bites.